The winter of 1945 hung over the American heartland like a quiet breath after a storm. Across the flatlands of Texas, a train rolled slowly through endless fields of brown grass and empty wind. Inside the sealed cars sat a dozen German women, soldiers, nurses, clerks of the defeated Reich, now prisoners of war. Their uniforms were threadbare, their insignia stripped away, their eyes hollow from weeks of silence and the taste of dust. For days, they had crossed a country that felt unreal. From the ports of the East Coast, through the soft hills of the South, to this wide, endless plain where fences stretched like the horizon itself. They had expected to see barbed wire, rifles, and the eyes of hatred. Instead, they saw the open sky, bigger than anything in Europe, and fields that looked too generous for war. No one spoke on the train. There was shame in their posture, pride in their silence. The propaganda that had raised them still whispered in their ears, "America is barbarish. America is barbaric." They had been told that American men were crude, violent, soulless, drunk on machines and greed. Now, as the sun set in streaks of red over the Texas horizon, the light fell through the cracks in the train car, painting their faces gold. For the first time, a few dared to look out. The station came without warning. Just a small platform, a flag fluttering, a sign that read, "Hearn." The guards opened the doors. The air outside was warm, dry, and smelled faintly of hay and smoke. They stepped down, one by one, boots scraping the gravel. The guards were young Americans, barely older than the prisoners themselves. Their uniforms were clean, their rifles slung casually. There was no shouting, no hitting. One of them, freckles on his face and dust on his collar, said simply, "Welcome to Texas, ma'am." That word, "ma'am," fell into the air like a stone dropped into still water. None of the women moved. None replied. They stood there, staring. One of them, a former Red Cross nurse from Hamburg, blinked hard, as if to be sure she had heard it right. Respect, in the mouth of a victor. The camp was not what they expected. Instead of concrete and iron, it was rows of wooden barracks, trimmed with white paint, surrounded by a wire fence that looked almost symbolic, high enough to remind them they were captives, but not cruel. Beyond it stretched the Texas prairie, where windmills turned slowly in the dusk. The smell of supper drifted through the air. Beans, bread, and coffee. Inside the infirmary, the air was cool and clean. White curtains divided the cots. The women were told to line up for examination. Routine procedure, the guard said. A nurse in khaki approached them. Her accent was southern, her tone gentle but firm. She handed each woman a small cloth bag, soap, toothbrush, towels, and something soft, unfamiliar, wrapped in paper. One of the women unfolded it, frowning. It was white, padded, shaped oddly, like nothing she had seen before. "What is this?" she asked in broken English. The nurse smiled kindly. "For you," she said, "sanitary pads." The room froze. For a moment, there was only the sound of the ceiling fan and the quiet shuffle of boots. Then one woman, tall and thin, the kind who once lectured others on Aryan purity, let out a small sound, half gasp, half sob. She looked at the item again, turned it over, and pressed it to her chest. Another woman began to cry openly, her hands trembling. In Nazi Germany, such products had been rare, even among officers' wives. War had stripped the country of comforts. Women used rags, washed, and reused them. Hygiene was a private misery. Yet here, in the land of the enemy, they were handed these disposable miracles as casually as if they were bread. The nurse, not understanding the depth of the reaction, said quietly, There's plenty more where that came from. Don't worry, plenty more. The phrase echoed. It was not just the pads. It was what they symbolized. Abundance, dignity, a civilization that could afford kindness. That night, the women lay in their bunks, unable to sleep. Outside, the guards talked softly under the glow of lanterns. The sound of laughter drifted faintly through the air. An easy, human sound they had not heard in years. Inside, some of the prisoners wept quietly, not from fear, but from confusion. How could the enemy show such care? How could a nation that had bombed their cities offer them comfort with its hands? One of them, a schoolteacher from Bremen, whispered into the darkness, "Perhaps this is how they conquered us. Not with guns, but with mercy." In another corner, a nurse whispered back, "No, with factories. They can make even compassion by the millions." No one laughed. The thought lingered in the stale air of the barracks. They were realizing something that no propaganda could have prepared them for. That power could exist not in the clenched fist, but in the open hand. As dawn crept over the Texas plains, light filtered through the wooden slats of the barracks, touching the faces of the sleeping women. The wind outside carried the scent of wild grass and diesel fuel. Somewhere beyond the fences, a train whistle blew, long and low, like a memory fading into the distance. It was the sound of a world that had ended, and the beginning of something none of them could yet name. The next morning, as the Texas sun painted the prairie gold, the German women lined up for roll call. They stood rigid, out of habit, the way they had been trained in military schools and civil service offices of the Reich. Heels clicked, back straight, eyes forward, even in captivity. Yet something had already shifted beneath their composure. They no longer feared being shot for stepping out of line. No dogs snarled at their feet. No officers screamed. Instead, a sergeant in a faded U.S. uniform read their names in halting German and offered a quiet nod at each one. It felt like a performance without an audience, an old play whose stage had disappeared. Inside the barracks, each woman was assigned a metal-framed cot, a blanket, and a small wooden locker. There was soap, real soap, cut thick like a bar of butter, not the gray lye mix rations they had known in Germany. Alongside it, toothpaste, bandages, and 2 clean white towels, soft as cotton fields. There were no speeches, no punishments, just order, gentle, unwavering. The Americans seemed uninterested in domination. They offered rules, but not fear. This confused them more than cruelty ever could. For the women of Nazi Germany, dignity had come through discipline. Hygiene was sacred, yes, but survival was practical. By 1944, German cities had run dry of feminine care. Water was rationed, fuel was reserved for tanks, and women were expected to endure. Blood and pain were seen as strength. Even luxury was laced with suffering, nylon replaced with scratchy wool, soap diluted, toilet paper replaced with newspapers or notepaper. To complain was to betray the national struggle. They had been taught that sacrifice was noble, that discomfort was righteous, and above all, that softness belonged to the weak. But now, in America, even prisoners received softness. The shock was psychological. In the dining hall that afternoon, the women sat at long wooden tables beneath ceiling fans that turned lazily overhead. The guards did not eat with them, but they watched respectfully from the side. No one barked orders. A young corporal, barely out of high school, brought them trays piled with beans, cornbread, cooked carrots, and stewed meat. Another followed with tall glasses of iced tea. Sugar clinging to the sides, condensation glistening in the heat. A nurse walked through the rows, her eyes checking for signs of illness. When she spotted a woman clutching her stomach in discomfort, she knelt beside her. pressing a hand to her forehead. "You need rest," the nurse said, and signaled for her to be escorted gently back to the infirmary. To be tended to like this, by the enemy, was too much. The woman broke down. The tears came fast, hot, unstoppable. She shook her head, muttering, "Ich bin fined. Ich bin fined. I am the enemy. I am the enemy." The nurse didn't understand the words, but she put her hand on the woman's shoulder and said, "Not here, you're not." That sentence lingered long after the nurse left. Not here, you're not. What was this place? Camp Hearne was just one of 511 POW camps scattered across the United States. By 1945, it housed not just soldiers, but secretaries, translators, female communications officers, and clerical staff, many of whom had never held a rifle, but were still loyal to the Führer's vision. Loyal, that is, until now. Because something was happening in Texas. Something no interrogation or air raid could have achieved. It was not indoctrination. It was contrast. They had spent years in a society that demanded endurance at all costs. And now they found themselves inside one that offered care without hesitation, comfort without pride. The United States, they realized, didn't just fight with guns. It fought with production. Factories that once made radios now churned out soap and sanitary pads. Fields that once fed only Americans now fed their enemies too. Even kindness was industrialized here. It was one thing to lose a war to a superior army. It was another to lose to a society that could mass-produce dignity. And the evidence came in small, quiet moments. One woman, young, barely 22, stood frozen in front of the sink in the washroom. There, mounted on the wall, was a metal box. A sign above it read, "Sanitary napkins. Take one as needed." She opened the lid and gasped. Inside were dozens, all neatly packed, clean, free. She did not take just one. She took 5, 6, folded them into her skirt, and whispered thanks to no one in particular. She was not stealing. She was hoarding mercy. She remembered her mother's screams during air raids, the blood-stained towels soaked in buckets, the shame of stained skirts. And now, here in the land of her enemies, these needs were anticipated, answered, solved, without judgment. The doctrine of the Reich had promised glory through suffering, but this was power, real power, silent, clean, and warm. That night, a group of the women gathered under the low light of a single bulb in the barracks. The air was heavy with heat and thought. They whispered not of escape or rebellion, but of the strangeness of it all. "They feed us," one said. "They treat us," said another. "They respect us," whispered a third. A silence followed. Then one said what the others feared. "Maybe everything we were told was wrong." The room fell still. That idea was too big, too dangerous, but it had been said. Outside, the Texas sky was ink black and wide. Somewhere beyond the wire, a nightbird called out. The guards paced slowly beneath the towers, casting long shadows. Inside, on the edge of sleep, the women lay still, listening to the whir of the fan, the rustle of cotton sheets, and the quiet crumbling of a world they had once believed in. The next morning, the smell of soap lingered like a strange ghost in the air. It clung to their hands, to the wooden rails of the bunks, even to the simple cotton dresses they had been issued. Cleanliness, that forgotten luxury, now filled every corner of Camp Hearne's women's barracks. It was not just a scent. It was a message. The Americans seemed obsessed with hygiene. Buckets of clear water stood ready at every barrack door. The infirmary reeked of antiseptic and sunlight. Laundry lines stretched like white ribbons across the yard, heavy with drying clothes. Even the latrines were scrubbed daily, not by prisoners, but by maintenance staff. Paid men who whistled while they worked. To the German women, it felt like being trapped inside a contradiction. In Nazi Germany, they had been told America was filthy, morally and physically, a place of chaos, of racial mixing, of women who lacked discipline. And yet here, even the dirt seemed orderly. Even the air smelled cleaner. One of them, Lotte Müller, a typist from Leipzig, stared at the basin where a bar of ivory soap sat waiting. She rubbed it in her hands and watched the bubbles rise. They shimmered like glass in the sunlight, thin and fragile. She hadn't seen foam like that in years. During the last months of the war, German soap had been made from animal fat, dark and rough. Sometimes, the rumors said, it was made from something worse. Lotte never believed it. But now, with the scent of pure white soap in her palms, she began to wonder. When the guards brought them buckets of hot water to wash their hair, some of the women refused. It felt like a trick. In their minds, comfort was always followed by punishment. In the Reich, kindness had been a tool, a way to break will. They didn't yet understand that here, kindness was routine. That day, an American nurse named Grace entered the barracks. She was in her late 20s, with sleeves rolled to her elbows and a cross pinned to her pocket. She carried a clipboard and a smile that seemed both tired and genuine. "Ladies," she said slowly, enunciating each word, "we'll be doing medical checks today. Lice, fever, infection, nothing to fear." Her German was rough, but understandable. The women lined up. Grace moved carefully, checking their eyes, ears, and hands. When she reached a prisoner named Hildegard, a tall, proud former factory overseer, she noticed deep, raw cracks on her fingers. "Detergent burns?" Grace asked softly. Hildegard hesitated, then nodded. "From chemicals, in the munitions plant." Grace frowned, then gently rubbed a small dab of ointment over the wounds. Hildegard flinched, not from pain, but from the unfamiliar sensation of being touched with care. "Keep this," Grace said, handing her a small tin of Vaseline. "Use it twice a day." The German woman stared at it, confused. "For me?" "Yes," Grace said, "for you." When the nurse moved on, Hildegard stared at the tin as if it were gold. She traced the English letters on its lid. Pure petroleum jelly. The word pure caught her eye. It seemed to describe not just the product, but the act itself. That night, she shared it with the others, passing it around like contraband. Each woman took a small dab, rubbing it into her dry hands, her cracked lips, her elbows. They laughed quietly, not mockery, but disbelief. The laughter of those who realize the world they knew has lied to them. Later that evening, Lotte stepped outside for air. The Texas wind moved gently through the barbed wire, humming a low metallic note. Across the camp, floodlights glowed softly, not blinding, not harsh, but protective. She could see the silhouettes of guards talking, smoking, leaning casually against fences. There was no hatred in their stance, no contempt. In the distance, she saw the nurse again. Grace sitting on a step, writing in a notebook under the lamplight. Lotte wondered what she wrote, reports, lists, or maybe thoughts about them. The German women behind the wire. The prairie was quiet, except for the rhythmic chirp of crickets and the faint hum of an engine somewhere beyond the camp. The air smelled faintly of soap, hay, and gasoline. The scent of a nation that had mastered both machinery and mercy. Lotte whispered into the darkness. "If this is defeat, it smells better than victory." The others didn't hear her. They were inside, folding towels, mending seams, or simply sitting still, hands idle for the first time in years. Days turned into weeks. The routine of Camp Hearne settled over them like a strange kind of peace. Breakfast came at the same hour. Mail was delivered, censored but regular. Medical inspections were frequent. The guards were firm but not cruel. And with each passing day, the women grew quieter. Not out of fear, but reflection. Their thoughts began to drift backward, to the bombed streets of Cologne, the ration lines, the endless propaganda posters that told them how superior they were. And then they would look around, at the clean sheets, the endless supplies of soap, the sanitary pads stocked in every barrack bathroom, and feel the bitter taste of irony. The Reich had promised greatness. America delivered comfort. Slowly, they began to understand what the war had truly been about. Not just territory or ideology, but the soul of modern life. Who could create a world that treated even its prisoners with humanity? At dusk, as the camp lights flickered on, Grace passed by the fence again, humming softly, her steps light on the gravel. The women watched her through the wire, her shadow stretching long in the amber glow. No words were spoken. But something unspoken moved through them. A quiet understanding that this woman, this nurse with gentle eyes and American steel in her posture, represented something far greater than she knew. And for the first time, the prisoners felt not humiliation, but longing, not to escape, not to fight, but to be worthy of a world that could smell this clean. By the third week at Camp Hearne, something intangible had begun to unravel inside the German women. Not their routines, but their beliefs. It didn't break all at once. Ideologies rarely do. They unravel in silence, from within, like a fraying thread in a tightly woven flag. The first tears didn't come from interrogation or accusation. They came from silence, from routine, from the relentless contrast between what they had been taught and what they now saw each day. Every morning, the bugle would sound across the camp, low, steady, not angry. They would rise, wash their faces in clean basins, and eat quietly in the mess hall. American guards served their meals without disdain. Nurses checked their health with unforced kindness, and no matter how the prisoners responded, with icy glares, stiff posture, or muttered German contempt, the Americans remained unshaken. It was maddening. Helga Brandt, once a proud member of the Nazi Party's Women's League, felt it first. Her sense of self had always been anchored to duty, to a belief in German supremacy, in racial order, in sacrifice for the fatherland. She had volunteered for clerical work in the Luftwaffe and had worn her uniform with pride, even when the sirens wailed over Berlin. Now in Texas, she felt irrelevant. The Americans didn't hate her. They didn't fear her. They didn't even need her. They just treated her like a human being, and that shook her more than any Allied bomb. One afternoon, she was called to help unload crates of supplies for the infirmary: soap, cotton, iodine, pads. The nurse in charge, Grace, handed her a clipboard. "I was told you're organized," Grace said. "Can you check off inventory as we go?" Helga stared at her, confused. "You trust me?" Grace raised an eyebrow. "You're literate, right?" Helga nodded slowly. "Then I trust your handwriting." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't friendship. It was worse. It was normalcy. And in that moment, Helga realized she had been raised in a world where women gained power only by serving men. Whether in factories, offices, or childbearing halls. But here, American women ran the camp infirmary, filed the reports, distributed the medicine, issued orders. They didn't scream. They didn't flinch. And they didn't wait for approval. This was not just the defeat of Germany's armies. This was the quiet conquest of a different kind of womanhood. That night, Helga sat at the edge of her bunk and looked at her hands. They were clean. She could smell the lemon-scented lotion she had been given. On the table beside her lay a small notebook, blank pages, provided by the camp. She hadn't written for herself in years. She opened it. Her hand hesitated above the page, as if afraid of what might come out. Then, slowly, she wrote in careful German cursive, "The Reich taught us we were superior. But superiority should not be so easily humbled by soap, by medicine, by kindness. Or perhaps it was never real." She closed the notebook, heart pounding. 2 bunks away, Anna Weber, once a translator for the foreign ministry, was staring at the ceiling. She had heard the rumors that the American Red Cross had fed prisoners during the early bombings, that General Eisenhower had personally ordered humane treatment for Axis soldiers, that some guards in other camps even played music for their captives. Propaganda had painted the Americans as savages. But Anna now wondered, if the enemy shows more mercy than your leaders ever did, who truly lost the war? In the following days, something extraordinary began to take shape. The women asked for more books. They started requesting English dictionaries. Some even joined informal classes run by American volunteers, learning grammar, pronunciation, conversation. The guards joked, but never mocked. The nurses helped with pronunciation. Grace smiled as one woman tried to say dignity, and instead whispered, "Dig City." They laughed together. It was, in many ways, the first real education some of these women had ever received. Not in the rote slogans of the Reich, but in language, logic, and the unspoken etiquette of democracy. And still, the camp remained a prison. The fences still stood. Freedom was not theirs, but dignity. Dignity was being returned piece by piece. The act of being clean, the chance to speak freely, the ability to sit in silence without fear of being reported. Even menstruation, once a monthly humiliation under the Reich, became manageable, unspoken, dignified. Sanitary pads were restocked weekly. There was no rationing, no shaming. It was such a simple thing. Yet for women who had once wrapped rags around themselves and washed them in bomb crater water, it was everything. One night, a storm rolled over the Texas sky. Rain lashed the barracks roof like 1,000 tiny fists. Thunder cracked the silence. Inside, the women huddled in their bunks, startled, not by fear, but by memory. Storms over Leipzig, fires over Hamburg, the shriek of air raid sirens. But this storm brought no bombs, no fear, just rain. As lightning lit the wooden walls of their shelter, Helga whispered to Anna, "I feel safer here than I ever did in Germany." Anna didn't answer. She only reached over and took her hand. For a long time, they sat like that, the storm outside raging, the silence inside settling. 2 German women, once believers in strength through blood and soil, now sitting quietly in a place they were told was hell, and discovering that mercy was more powerful than any ideology. By early spring of 1945, the trees beyond Camp Hearne began to flower faintly, clusters of pale blossoms trembling in the Texas wind. The days grew longer, and with them came a new rhythm. The air, once tense with suspicion, now felt suspended in a strange peace, one that neither side fully understood. And then came the letters. They arrived once a week in canvas sacks, sorted and censored by U.S. intelligence before being handed to the camp administrators. Each envelope was like a time capsule from the broken Reich, sent by families who didn't yet know if their daughters were alive, who didn't know their homes had been flattened, who still wrote with the language of Hitler's Germany, signing off with Sieg Heil or Für den Führer. But for the women of Camp Hearne, these letters struck a different nerve now. They no longer believed in those slogans. One by one, they read the news from home. A mother in Dresden, her handwriting shaky, said she had survived the bombing but had lost her youngest child. A sister in Frankfurt described eating potato peels for dinner. A neighbor wrote that the old bakery had collapsed into rubble, and that the black market price for a bar of soap was higher than for bread. Soap, the same white bars that now lined the shelves of every barracks room, stacked without ration or fear. Some women wept over their letters. Others folded them silently, their eyes hollow. Still others tore them into pieces and flushed them down the latrine as if trying to bury the last remnants of who they once were. But the most unexpected change came not from the letters received, but from the letters sent. Camp Hearne, like many American POW camps, allowed prisoners to write home. 1 page. Once a week. All letters were censored, both by the Americans and later by German authorities, should the war continue. And yet, the women wrote. They wrote in careful language, threading truth through the censor's eye. Some described the weather, others mentioned food. But between the lines, something deeper pulsed. Confusion, guilt, awakening. Hildegard, the former factory supervisor, wrote to her husband on the Eastern Front. They treat us cleanly here. The Americans are organized, quiet. Their nurses are women, but they command respect. I cannot explain the contradiction yet. Only that I no longer feel like an enemy in their hands. Lotta, ever more poetic, wrote simply, "Today I used a cotton pad that smelled like lavender. It reminded me of things I didn't know I had forgotten. The war feels very far from here, and yet it has never been closer inside me." Each letter was like a thread in a tapestry that slowly began to replace the flag once stitched into their hearts. Some guards noticed the change too. Private James Holloway, who had watched over the camp since January, wrote in his own journal, "They used to glare at us like we were monsters. Now they nod. Some even smile. They talk less, but listen more. One of them, I think her name is Anna, thanked me today for the mail. Not in English, just a quiet danke. But the way she said it, it felt real." The Americans didn't always know what to make of it. To them, these women had once served a regime that leveled London, murdered millions, and burned Europe to ash. Yet now they were just women, quiet, tired, and far from home. One afternoon, Grace, the nurse, found a folded paper tucked beneath her clipboard. No signature, no name. It read, "I was told you would hate me. I was told your kind were beasts. But you washed my wounds. You handed me soap. You handed me dignity. How do I say thank you without betraying everything I was taught?" Grace read it twice. Then she folded it and placed it in her pocket. She didn't tell anyone. Some things she knew didn't need to be reported. That night, the women asked for more English lessons. Not just nouns and verbs, but phrases. How to say thank you. I'm sorry, I didn't know. And the American volunteers taught them, slowly, kindly. Some even brought old school books, children's dictionaries, flashcards. One phrase became particularly popular. I am learning. They said it over and over, like a chant. Some with pride, others with trembling hesitation. But the act of saying it was an admission and a surrender. To learn is to change. To change is to let go. And to let go of ideology, especially one that shaped your entire world, is not easy. It hurts. And so, at night, some of them cried again. But these tears were different. Not for lost battles or broken cities, but for the weight of having believed in something false and having been freed not by force, but by mercy. In one corner of the barracks, Anna kept a small collection now. A wrapper from a soap bar, a used pad folded neatly into a memory box, a receipt from the infirmary. These were her trophies, not of conquest, but of awakening. She would show them to no one. But in the quiet hours before dawn, she would open the box, run her fingers along the folded paper, and whisper, "We lost the war long before the Allies arrived. We lost it the moment we forgot how to care for the weak. Outside, the Texas wind moved through the fences like a lullaby. The crickets chirped, the lights dimmed, and somewhere between barbed wire and forgetfulness, a new kind of woman was beginning to emerge. Not shaped by the Reich, but by what it had never understood, that strength is not forged through fear, but through compassion. Camp Hearne's rhythms settled into a quiet hum. Days unfolded in even, repetitive beats. Roll call, meals, inspection, chores, rest. But beneath this gentle routine, a transformation was deepening. It wasn't marked by drama or ceremony. It came through soap and hot water, cotton pads and cotton sheets, through clean hands, through warm food. It came through kindness, produced, distributed, and replenished like ammunition in a different kind of war. The women began to talk among themselves, in tones no longer rigid, no longer echoing party slogans or the clipped cadence of military German. Their language softened. The sneers faded. The pride, still there, now coexisted with questions. They asked things they had never dared to ask before. Do you think they would have treated our men like this? What if they had won? Would we have done the same? Is it weakness to care this much for an enemy? The answers didn't come quickly. But the questions mattered more now than the old certainty ever had. One morning, the camp organized a hygiene day. It was voluntary. But nearly every woman showed up. Buckets of warm water stood ready. New brushes, clean rags, extra soap. American nurses supervised, but didn't intrude. They handed out fresh undergarments, including disposable items most of the women had never seen before. Some blushed when they received them. Others touched them with the reverence of someone handling lace or silk. They weren't beautiful. They were practical, mass-produced, stamped with numbers and codes. But they were dignified. And for women who had spent months bleeding into rags during air raids or scavenging through bombed-out medical stores for scraps of gauze, this was more than comfort. It was restoration. There was a dignity in not having to beg for what your body needed. In Germany, such products had been reserved for wives of officers, if they existed at all. In the camps, they were given freely, not because the prisoners had earned it, but because someone had decided they deserved it. Not as Germans, not as enemies, but as women. One of the younger prisoners, Irma from Stuttgart, said aloud what many had begun to think. This is power too, not bombs. This. The others didn't laugh. In the following weeks, a quiet project took shape. Grace and the other nurses, moved by the women's growing openness, began working with camp officials to assemble small hygiene kits. A bar of soap, a comb, nail clippers, a cloth, sanitary pads, and a slip of paper with the phrase, "You are worth caring for." They intended to distribute them across the camp's female barracks. At first, the idea felt strange, even to the nurses themselves. Why offer comfort to those who had served a regime of cruelty? Why go beyond the Geneva Convention's requirements? But Grace remembered something her father, a World War I medic, had once told her. Mercy is not something you ration like rations. It's something you grow, and the more you give it, the more it multiplies. The first time the kits were handed out, the response was quiet. No applause, no open tears. Just a solemn stillness. The women sat on their bunks, holding the small cloth bags like sacred things. Some opened them slowly, as if they feared the contents would vanish. Others closed them without looking, as if to preserve the mystery. But the message had landed. You are worth caring for. No regime had ever told them that. No slogan had ever promised them that. No uniform had ever guaranteed that. And now, across a dusty Texas plain under the hum of American floodlights, it was being given to them by strangers. One by one, the women began writing in their notebooks. Not about Hitler, not about the war, but about their bodies, their fears, their mothers, their guilt, their hope. Anna, who had once translated for Nazi officials, now scribbled poetry in English. The pad is white, like paper, like snow, like the space between what I was and what I am becoming. She folded the poem into her kit and said nothing more. That week, the infirmary reported a sharp drop in infections among the women. Nurses noted fewer cases of fever, rash, and abdominal distress. Cleanliness wasn't just a symbol anymore, it was salvation. The Americans weren't trying to win hearts. Not deliberately. But their system, the sheer scale of it, did something that propaganda never could. It wore down ideology with routine mercy. It mass-produced dignity until it overwhelmed suspicion. Every sanitary pad, every bottle of iodine, every gesture of care. It wasn't just aid. It was proof. Proof that a society built on abundance could afford not to hate. Proof that freedom wasn't just a flag. It was soap, hot water, and the will to share it. Helga, who had once boasted of Nazi discipline, now sat on her cot teaching two younger prisoners how to pronounce freedom in English. Freedom, she repeated slowly, carefully, and when one of them asked, "What does it mean, really?" she answered without hesitation. "It means not being afraid to ask for what you need, and knowing no one will hurt you for it." Outside, the sky darkened. Texas stars shimmered overhead. The guards walked their routes in silence. Somewhere beyond the barracks, the sound of laughter drifted from the kitchen. Inside, the women slept, clean, fed, and deeply unsettled, because in the stillness of the night, they understood that what they had been handed was not weakness. It was something far harder to resist, a factory of kindness. By April of 1945, the war in Europe was nearing its final, grinding collapse. Rumors trickled through the fences of Camp Hearne like wind through prairie grass. Hitler's name was whispered less often, and when it was, it no longer carried awe, only silence. The Reich was dying, and the women inside the Texas camp were quietly preparing for a world without it. But change did not only come from without. It was happening within. Each woman had once worn a uniform. Luftwaffe secretaries, Wehrmacht messengers, Red Cross nurses, communications officers. Their roles had not involved combat, but they had still served the machine. They had worn the eagle, signed papers, followed orders, and believed, or pretended to believe, in the righteousness of it all. Now, stripped of those uniforms, they were being seen not as soldiers of a broken empire, but simply as women. And that, more than captivity, was what truly undid them. For the first time in years, they were being treated not as instruments of policy, not as symbols of the Reich, not even as threats, but as people with bodies, with pain, with quiet dignity. The Americans never asked who they had been. They only asked, "Are you well? Do you need medicine? Do you have clean clothes?" The war had rendered them invisible back home. In the Reich, women had only mattered if they produced something: children, labor, loyalty. But here, in this dusty camp in Texas, they were asked, "Do you have enough pads? Do you have enough soap?" It was disarming. One morning, an older woman named Margarete collapsed during breakfast. The guards rushed to lift her from the floor, and the American nurse Grace arrived within minutes. She checked the woman's pulse, wrapped her in a blanket, and carried her, yes, carried her, to the infirmary. When Margarete awoke, she wept. Not from pain, but from something far deeper. No man had carried her since her father, long before the war. That single act, to be lifted gently by an enemy, rewrote something in her. Later that day, Grace sat at her side. Margarete stared at the nurse's hands, small, freckled, with short, clean nails. "You're younger than my daughter," she said softly in German. Grace didn't understand. But she smiled and squeezed her hand. That moment would stay with Margaret longer than any parade, any medal, any slogan she had once believed. The human hand could heal as much as it could hurt. And the Americans kept showing that truth day after day, without words. In the laundry area, the women now worked without being told. They folded each other's sheets. They left small cotton flowers tucked between folded towels. They shared spare sanitary pads like rations, no longer hoarding, but offering. When a new transport of women arrived from another camp in Arizona, ragged, frightened, brittle, the Hearne prisoners greeted them with clean clothes, water, and soap. No one had instructed them to do it. They had simply learned it. Some guards noticed. One wrote in his journal, "They're not prisoners anymore, not in the way they were. They help each other. They don't look afraid. I think they're finding something here we didn't mean to give them. Maybe freedom of the soul." In one of the English classes, the women practiced new phrases. What do you need? Do you feel okay? Would you like some help? Simple sentences, but layered with meaning. Helga, once the loudest believer in German pride, now corrected others gently when they mispronounced please or thank you. Lauda, the quiet poet, started drawing pictures of birds, always outside the wire, always flying. And Anna, who had once translated speeches about Aryan destiny, now wrote letters not to the party, but to her sister, asking about the children and including drawings of the camp's wildflowers. There was one flower, bluebonnet, that fascinated them most. It bloomed wildly outside the fence, despite the dust and heat. The women gave it a nickname in German, Freiheitsblume, the flower of freedom. They began pressing them between pages of their notebooks. They kept them hidden like tokens, not of escape, but of survival. One woman, Elise, took an unused sanitary pad and stitched the outline of a bluebonnet into the cotton. It was crude, but the others gasped when they saw it. A pad, once the symbol of shame, hidden and whispered, had become a canvas. She passed it around the barracks like a prayer flag. "This is who we are now," she said. "Not soldiers, not followers, not victims. Women alive." By nightfall, the embroidered pad was pinned quietly on the wall above the stove. No one spoke of it aloud, but each woman, in her own time, stood before it. Like before an altar, some crossed themselves, others closed their eyes. Outside, the Texas wind howled gently against the wire, but it no longer sounded like a barrier. The Reich had promised them honor through obedience, but it had taken defeat. Soap, cotton, and a nurse's freckled hand to show them the truth. Honor was not in serving power. It was in reclaiming tenderness. May arrived with heat. Dry, heavy Texas heat that clung to the skin and curled the edges of paper. The women at Camp Hearne no longer flinched when the guards called roll, no longer walked in silence, no longer carried themselves like shadows of a crumbling empire. They had begun to talk openly, not just among themselves, but to the Americans, in halting English, with nervous glances, with laughter. It was not a revolution in the way they'd once imagined revolutions. No flags raised, no fists clenched, but it was a rebellion, a quiet one, a rebellion against shame, against fear, against the voices that still whispered in their memories. Duty, blood, obedience, hate. Each day, they defied those voices simply by caring for one another. And the symbol of that defiance was not a rifle, not a torch, not a swastika torn down. It was a sanitary pad, a thing once hidden in sleeves or tucked beneath skirts in shame. Now folded with care, stitched with flowers, passed like an offering. For the women of Camp Hearne, hygiene was no longer routine. It was reclamation. It began with simple acts. 2 younger women started keeping count of the pad supply and asked Grace if they could help distribute them. They made bundles. 3 for each woman, wrapped with a note in English and German. You are seen. They left them on beds, on cots where new arrivals slept, on bunks where older women lay ill and didn't ask. And the change rippled outward. They taught each other how to wash more thoroughly, how to boil water properly when the sun couldn't do the work. They cut up old undershirts into soft cloths for those who bled heavier than others. They asked Grace for more antiseptic and taught themselves to apply it gently, without waste. They became nurses without training, caretakers without command. And perhaps most strikingly, they began to speak of their bodies, not with embarrassment, but with truth. I bled through last night. My stomach cramps before the moon is full. My back hurts when I lie on the wood. It was the first time many of them had ever named these things aloud. The Reich had trained them to endure pain without voice. Womanhood had been defined only by how many children you could bear, how well you could serve the fatherland. But here, with soap and pads and privacy, they began to understand. They were not just functions. They were not just vessels. They were human beings with cycles, with needs, with stories. Anna, always quiet, always writing, pinned a new poem above her bed, scrawled in uneven English. You called us enemy, but you gave us clean water. You called us danger, but you gave us soft cloth. You did not ask if we were sorry. You only asked if we were in pain. The guards read it and said nothing. But one of them, a boy from Kentucky, tore a sheet from his pocket notebook and wrote beneath it, "Pain speaks no language, but kindness does." He left it on her cot. She never saw who wrote it. But she folded the note and tucked it under her pillow like a prayer. Meanwhile, the outside world continued to collapse. Berlin had fallen. Hitler was dead. The Reich had become a ruin whispered about in past tense. And yet, in this Texas camp, far from the rubble, far from the flags and fire, the Reich was still dying, in a different way, not with gunfire, but with softness, with cotton, with clean hands. One day, an American officer arrived with news. The war in Europe was officially over. Some of the women cried. Not because they mourned Germany, but because they didn't know what would become of them now. Would they be shipped home to ruins? Would they be punished for having survived too well in enemy hands? Would they be seen as traitors for having changed? Helga asked Grace in broken English, "Will we be sent away now?" Grace paused, then said something the women had not expected. "We'll help you find where you belong, not just send you away." That word, belong, unlocked something. For the first time in years, the women realized. Maybe they could belong somewhere, not defined by uniforms or ideology. Maybe home could be rebuilt not with bricks, but with new ways of seeing the world. That evening, as dusk rolled in, and the blue bonnets glowed faint in the fading light, the women gathered without instruction. Someone had brought out the stitched pad, the one with the flower design. They placed it on the mess table. Beside it, they placed a second one, this one unmarked, plain, simple, and then a third with the word Frieden, peace, stitched in red thread. By the end of the week, there were dozens, an altar of care, of rebellion, of healing. They did not need sermons or songs. Only the knowledge that even after all they had seen, they still had the ability to create something kind, and in that, they were free. Freedom did not come with the opening of the gates. Not yet. Repatriation would take months. There were forms to fill, governments to stabilize, rail lines to rebuild across a scorched continent. But something far more important had already happened inside Camp Hearne. The Reich had lost its grip on their hearts. What no bomb could destroy, and no interrogation could pry loose, had been undone by warmth, hygiene, and the unrelenting decency of strangers. The ideology that once made them feel powerful now seemed childish. It had promised greatness, but starved their dignity. It had taught them silence was strength, that blood made them pure, and that softness was shame. But here, in the unlikely sanctuary of an enemy prison camp in Texas, they had discovered a deeper truth. Tenderness was not weakness. It was survival. Care was not submission. It was courage. And above all, cleanliness was not luxury. It was love made practical. For the first time, they were no longer ashamed of their womanhood. They embraced it. They spoke of it. They looked after it, together. The sanitary pad, once a symbol of what the Reich ignored, ridiculed, or suppressed, had become their quiet flag of resistance. Each one folded, each one shared, each one embroidered, a reminder that their bodies were not shameful, not invisible, not secondary to the war machines that once consumed them. When the Americans noticed the embroidered pads pinned across the barracks, they didn't laugh. They didn't ask questions. They only offered more thread, more cloth, more time. And the women kept stitching. Names, dates, simple prayers, tiny bluebonnets, even the word Danke in pink thread. Each pad became a story, not of blood, but of rebirth. The American guards, many of them just boys from Tennessee, Ohio, or Kansas, began treating these creations like holy things. They walked past them silently, hats in hand. One even built a small wooden frame to protect a particularly detailed piece from dust. Without knowing it, the women had created a museum of the invisible, of the things men in power had never wanted to see, of cycles and sacrifice, of shame turned sacred, of survival through softness. And through it all, the camp kept moving. Meals, roll calls, letters home. But now, the letters said different things. Anna wrote, "The world they built for us is gone. I do not want it back. I would rather live in a country that gives soap to its prisoners than one that demands loyalty without mercy." Lotta wrote to her cousin in Hamburg, "I bled this month, and it did not hurt my dignity. The Americans gave me cloth, water, and silence. That is more than our own country ever offered." The women now spoke of home with caution, not longing, because they knew that what awaited them in the fatherland was not the same world they had left. Germany was ash, its leaders dead or fleeing, its lies exposed. And yet, in a twist of history no one had predicted, it was in captivity that these women had reclaimed their liberty, because America had not conquered them with tanks. It had dismantled them with kindness engineered at scale. They could not stop talking about it. "This country made 4 billion pads a year," said Helga one morning, reading a magazine scrap left behind in the mess. 4 billion, enough for every woman, even prisoners. "No country at war does that," Anna said, "unless it believes women matter, even when they bleed." They were beginning to see America not just as a victor, but as an idea, not perfect, not innocent, but expansive, capable of seeing value in things the Reich had discarded. Softness, diversity, mercy. And in that vision, they saw a future, one they might one day help build. So they practiced more English, more letters, more sketches. They held discussion circles. Some wrote journals. Others asked Grace to explain the word vote. "What does it mean?" one asked. "It means you choose who leads you," Grace replied. The women fell silent. In their entire lives, they had never done that. They had followed, obeyed, saluted, but choose? The idea felt dangerous and exhilarating. It made the thread in their hands feel heavier. Because now, each embroidered pad, each shared bar of soap, each offered word of comfort, it all meant more. It meant they were no longer waiting to be saved. They were already saving each other. Outside, the heat pressed against the wire fences. The prairie grass had turned golden. Bluebonnets still dotted the edges of the dirt roads. And then, one morning, a truck arrived. A convoy. Repatriation had begun. The first names were called. Not all, just a few. But the beginning had come. As the women packed their few belongings, notebooks, folded sheets, the little bags of supplies they treated like treasure, one question lingered in all their minds. What would we do with this new self once we crossed the ocean? Would Germany understand who they had become? Would their fathers, their brothers, the ones who had sent them off to serve a dream that never included their dignity? Anna folded her embroidered pad last. She didn't hide it. She placed it on top of her clothes like a crown. And just before boarding the truck, she turned to Grace. "You didn't just give us comfort," she said in slow, accented English. "You gave us a mirror." Grace said nothing, but she understood. Sometimes the greatest victory doesn't arrive with fanfare or parades. Sometimes it is stitched in silence, one thread at a time, across the soft cotton of something once shameful, something that only the defeated would ever understand. That true civilization is not how you treat the strong, but how you care for the powerless. The trucks rumbled out of Camp Hearne at dawn. Tires crackled over gravel. Dust trailed behind them like smoke from an extinguished fire. Inside, the German women sat quietly on wooden benches, their hands folded over their knees or gripping the edges of small canvas duffel bags. None of them looked back at the barracks, but all of them felt it, like a ghost still resting in the air. The fences, the watchtowers, the guards' boots on packed dirt. Those would fade in memory. What would not fade were the quiet things. The bar of soap, wrapped once in brown paper and given without question. The warmth of a cotton pad pressed into a trembling palm. The phrase, repeated in English until it took root in the soul. "You are worth caring for." That stayed. That changed everything. They passed through towns on the way to the port. American towns, ordinary and vibrant in ways that felt almost alien. Children ran barefoot through grassy yards. Women carried sacks of groceries, pushing baby strollers across wide sidewalks. Boys sat on porches, tuning radios. There were no craters, no rubble, no fear. In Germany, they had learned to flinch at every sound. A siren, a creak, a knock. But here, everything felt open, as if the sky itself had never learned how to fall. Some of the women stared in silence. Others leaned their foreheads to the glass, watching it all like a film. And then came the harbor, the ship that would take them east, toward the continent they no longer recognized. The guards stood in formation and read out names one last time. No shouts, no commands, only names, spoken gently, like farewells. At the gangplank, the American nurse Grace approached with a small parcel. She gave one to each woman, a cloth pouch tied with string. Inside, a bar of soap, a comb, a fresh pad, and a note written in longhand English. The same message for all. You were seen. You were more than a uniform. Never forget what kindness can rebuild. Some women clutched the parcel as if it were gold. Others cried. Not from sadness, but from something older. Something that had never been given voice until now. On board, as the ship groaned into motion and the Texas shoreline slipped into mist, the women opened their bags and shared what they had kept. A stitched bluebonnet, a pressed flower, a worn English dictionary, the embroidered sanitary pad, now yellowing slightly at the edges, a folded note with the word freedom, written in a child's block script. None of these things had monetary value. But they were heavier than any weapon they had ever carried, because they were symbols of who they had become. Lotte, the poet, wrote in her journal that night, "The Reich gave us iron and fire, but the Americans gave us soap and silence. And it is the silence I will remember most. The silence of being treated gently, even when I did not deserve it." When they arrived in Germany, they found a land unfamiliar. Bombed cities, burned forests, roads choked with rubble and the lost. The old houses were skeletons. The institutions were shadows. The uniforms were gone, scattered like dead leaves. And yet, the women had returned not as ghosts, but as witnesses. They spoke softly, not with shame, but with clarity. They told their sisters and mothers about a camp in Texas, about hot water, about American nurses who spoke with kindness, about a strange invention, a disposable pad, offered freely and without embarrassment. Some listeners wept, others stared. A few, bitter with grief, called them traitors for speaking well of the enemy. But the seed had been planted, and over time, as Germany staggered into democracy, into reconstruction, into reflection, those seeds took root. The women of Camp Hearne became nurses, teachers, writers. One worked for the new Bundestag's Department on Women's Health. Another helped draft post-war hygiene standards for schools. Several volunteered with refugee aid groups, passing out clean garments and soap to the displaced, just as they had once received. And quietly, year by year, the shame around their bodies began to dissolve, because they had touched something sacred. And once touched, it could not be untouched. In a Berlin apartment, Anna kept the embroidered pad framed on her wall. In Munich, Helga taught a course on dignity in wartime. In Bremen, Margaret founded a clinic where women received free sanitary care. None of this made headlines, but all of it mattered. Because long after the flags had fallen and the generals had died, the war lived on. Not in museums, but in the minds of those who had survived it in the softest way. By learning how to be cared for. By learning how to care in return. Not one of them ever forgot Camp Hearne. Not for the fences, not for the rules, but for what it taught them in the quiet moments, when the world they had once served was crumbling, and the world they might help build was still being born. In those moments, there had been soap, there had been clean water, there had been silence, and there had been mercy. And in the center of it all, folded in linen, stitched in thread, passed from hand to trembling hand, was the softest, strangest thing they had ever carried home. A pad, a symbol, a beginning.